Um, so today we will be talking about poetic thinking, and there is a difference between poetic thinking and thinking through poetry, and we will try to look into both aspects of it. What is poetic thinking? And which means that thinking itself is a poetic thing. So what it means when we say that thinking is a poetic thing. At the same time, how to experience language, how to experience poetry, or to say how to think through poetry. This question of experience is also very important because last time when we were talking, we were largely talking about experience, that how we are more and more becoming incapable of experiencing. And what are the things which are what are the things which are making us experience less? How do we experience night? How do we experience things? How do we experience our own presence? And how do we experience other things? So this question of experience is also very much a question of poetic thinking. It's also very much a question of thinking. And as usual, we will start from some philosophical problems, some philosophical questions, and we'll try to see through those questions of philosophy, those aspects of philosophy, and then try to do some poetic thinking, or try to think through a poetry. As I have already mentioned in the last lecture, that a lot of problem of our thinking, or our unthinking, or our failure to think comes through what we call modernity, what we call scientific thinking, what we call subject-object distinction, and how science itself has made us a non-thinking animal. How technology, not only science, but science claim is bigger than technology, because science, as we have seen in the last class, relies on this factness, relies on exactness of things, and which is universal. So looking at nature becomes universal. So nature becomes universal, and nature's definition becomes universal. And then this universality basically keep creating subject and object, and then subject becomes a kind of God, a conscious being which defines the limitation of the object. So these are the things which we have already sort of discussed at length, and that was the point where we introduced Heidegger into our study, that how Heidegger is essential, how Heidegger is important, and what Heidegger tried to do throughout his work is to question that subject-object distinction, those boundaries of science and limitation of reason. So today we will see how Heidegger himself talk about language, about poetry, about thinking through poetry, about poetic thinking. And to begin with, Heidegger talks about, in his essay, The Nature of Language, about experiencing through language, and how do we experience through language? Can we experience through language? And this question we will return to Heidegger's, a proposition again and again, that man dwells in language. The dwelling place of man is language. And this is quite remarkable, and on that basis perhaps Heidegger would prophesize that what is going to come, what is going to be the future of mankind is homelessness, because man will no longer be able to experience language. And in a way we have seen that in the last lecture as well. But let's come to the beginning, and as I have reminded myself and reminded the people who are listening, and because listening is in a poetic activity, listening, and we will see that listening itself is an act of thinking, that to come to the arrival, to come to the beginning itself is the most difficult task. We never arrive to begin. And so here again, what I am going to do is that see that if we can arrive to that beginning. Heidegger says, to undergo an experience with something, be it a thing, a person, or a god, means that this something befalls us, strikes us, comes over us, overwhelms us, and transforms us. When we talk of undergoing an experience, we mean specifically that the experience is not of our own making. To undergo here means that we endure it, suffer it, receive it as it strikes us, and submit to it. It is this something itself that comes about, comes to pass, happens. Now, here is the important thing that perhaps is a critical point, that experience is not something which is already there. In a way, in a very vague and loose sense, when we say that experience your own presence, experience yourself, actually we never experience ourselves. There is nothing in a Heideggerian proposition to experience. An experience is something which is always experienced with something outside it. So let it be a thing, a person, or a god. Everything which is outside us, but at the same time it is necessary, it is perhaps important for one's own realization, for one's own presence, that one experience those things. But not experiencing like we experience, for example, something as an object, something which is outside us, by defining it, by limiting it, and then experiencing it by those limitations. What is Heidegger trying to say is that when we talk of undergoing an experience, we mean specifically that the experience is not of our own making, which means we shouldn't define at the beginning that what we are going to experience, which means we should never try to objectify what we are going to experience. Even by that standard, if we try to define most abstract things in the world and then try to experience it, for example, we talked about love, and how in our modern times, in our scientific time, we are empirically trying to see how much love someone have for something. So this experience itself shouldn't be our own making, and I think it's very important that experience should not be our own making. Experience should be something which we undergo, which we endure without defining, without limiting. And perhaps it's important that Heidegger mentioned God here, because by defining God, we are not experiencing God, but we are experiencing our own definition of the God, which means we are empirically, in a way, or seeing that whether my definition of God passes the test or not, in a way that we never experience the God. In the same way, Heidegger goes further and he says that to undergo an experience with language then means to let ourselves be properly concerned by the claim of language, by entering into and submitting to it. If it is true that man finds the proper abode of his existence in language, whether he is aware of it or not, then an experience we undergo with language will touch the innermost nexus of our existence. I think it is perhaps the most profound and important point here with the nature of language. There are two things which Heidegger is trying to say. One is the home of man, a person, a human being, is language. So one is not at home when he is not at language. Not only in sense of, and here what he means by language is also important, because his idea of language is not coming from a Saussurean point of view. Maybe there is some Wittgensteinian touch, but I'm not here trying to unlock or unpack Wittgenstein, but definitely it's not kind of language Heidegger is talking which is ruled by certain form of grammar. And grammar in many philosophical sense is a tyrannical thing, something which limits the scope of experience of the language itself. And perhaps on that note, Nietzsche would say, and Nietzsche has said already, that we cannot get rid of God because we cannot get rid of grammar. And I don't want to go there much, but second thing is what Heidegger is saying, which is very perhaps important, is that through language, and through, one should not understand that we are instrumentalizing a language. Heidegger would perhaps oppose that instrumentalization as well. What he means is that only through language, which means only by being in the language, only by dwelling in the language, one can touch the innermost nexus of our existence. And this is what we have seen earlier as well, and I will be repeating myself again and again, just to arrive at the beginning, which is Heidegger clearly distinguishes between thinking and philosophy. And philosophy for Heidegger is a thing which begins in Greece, which has a metaphysical ambition and which completely rely on metaphysics. On the contrary, thinking is something, and therefore Heidegger, when he says that in the most thought-provoking time, the most thought-provoking thing is that we are not thinking. And what he means here is very, very essential, because thinking is something which is not directed towards the external world. Thinking is primarily concerned with innermost nexus of a human being. What constitutes human being? What Heidegger would repetitively call is primordial being, Dasein. And to touch the Dasein, touch the primordial core, is what thinking is concerned with. And here it comes the problem of technology, because technology always pulls the man outside, always invite you, always takes you outside, and always try to reveal what is outside, which means that it is not interested in concealing, it is not interested in hiding, it does not want you to take where hidden things are, which means it always sort of circulating what is possible to be revealed, which means that thinking in time of technology is extremely difficult, because all what technology is doing is that not allowing you to think, which means not allowing you to touch the innermost core of the being, at the same time taking away the language of the being. And in that very sense, when language is taken from the being, man becomes homeless. And what Heidegger says is that homelessness is the future of humankind, because nobody will be able to dwell, perhaps by way where technology is becoming pervasive. It will be very difficult to perhaps experience. So if you take this point to begin the beginning and to remain in the beginning, so beginning is not a linear activity, and beginning does not mean that we are linear, there is a linear movement, there is an acceleration, but beginning means to begin, and that is only possible in language to say or to experience it. So Heidegger is basically talking of that experience through language, and that experience through language, which we will see further, is only possible through certain kind of poetic activity. Let's see further how Heidegger is defining or not defining, or perhaps trying to make us experience language. What is left for us to do is to point out ways that bring us face to face with the possibility of undergoing an experience with language. Such ways have long existed, but they are seldom used in such a manner that the possible experience with language is itself given voice and put into language. So the question is, can language experience language? Do language talk to itself through language? And it is interesting, because when it comes to the question of translation, it becomes even more evident when Robert Frost says that what is lost in translation is poetry, while Derrida has a very different take on it. And Derrida would argue that every text is mourning until translated. So the potential of a text is unleashed, and it reached its ultimate potential only through conversation with the language. But here it's not only the conversation of the language with the language, but the question of language experiencing language through language. In experiences which we undergo with language, language itself brings itself to language. So this is important, because if you think that what brings one to home, it's the home which brings one to home. If you try to imagine it like this, it is like this. So if Heidegger is saying that in experiences which we undergo with language, language itself brings itself to language, which means that it is only home which will invite us to home, and no other invitation. So if I say that someone else is asking me to come to my own home, it is not an invitation. It is not possible. If something will invite me to my own home, it will be the home itself. So the home will invite me to home. So language itself will help in a way, or it will bring the experience out. I'm skipping few things. And then Heidegger asks, but when does language speak itself as language? Curiously enough, when we cannot find the right words for something that concerns us, carries us away, oppresses or encourages us, then we leave unspoken what we have in mind, and without rightly giving it thought, undergo moments in which language itself has distantly and fleetingly touched us with its essential being. And perhaps this is resonating with the theme which Wittgenstein has later picked. Later picked means in his later work, not after Heidegger. Is that Wittgenstein is making two important points, that to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life, and form of life cannot be dissociated, cannot be detached. And this is what Derrida in a way picks in his Question to Hospitality, that when someone arrives at your shore and you ask him or her to speak the language of the host, this is the first mark of violence on a migrant. This is the first mark of violence on a refugee, because despite that language resists all mobility. Heidegger says that language resists all mobility. He has to suffer this violence, that to speak in the language of the host. In a way, it has to abandon the home, not of only the home which was on the other side of the ocean, but also the home in which he was dwelling. And then Wittgenstein talks about that what we cannot imagine, what we don't have language for, we cannot perhaps imagine. So our imagination is always at the mercy of language. But which language? Heidegger further goes that, but when the issue is to put into language something which has never yet been spoken, then everything depends on whether language gives or withholds the appropriate word. Such is the case of the poet. Now he is coming that how do you experience language as language? How language speaks? How language speaks itself as language? And here Heidegger is saying, such is the case of the poet. Indeed, a poet might even come to the point where he is compelled in his own way, that is poetically, to put into language the experience he undergoes with language. And I think that's a profound statement, and we will try to read it again. But when the issue is to put into language something which has never yet been spoken, then everything depends on whether language gives or withholds the appropriate word. Such is the case of the poet. Indeed, a poet even comes to the point where he is compelled in his own way, that is, poetically, to put into language the experience he undergoes with language. And perhaps this is why any activity of language becomes a poetic activity. Not only that, any act of thinking through language is a poetic act. In that sense, thinking is a poetic act. And what we do by not doing a poetic act of thinking is basically a form of violence on the language. And here I would like to just mention the case of Rilke. And Rilke is defining poetry, and he's saying that when writing poetry, one is always assisted and even carried away by the rhythm of all things outside, for the lyric cadence is that of nature, of the waters, the wind, the night. But in order to shape prose rhythmically, one has to immerse oneself deeply within oneself and detect the blurt's anonymous multivariate rhythm. Prose is to be built like a cathedral. There one is truly without name, without ambitions, without help, up in the scaffolding, alone with one's own conscience. Now, this is the poetic activity because a poet can only dwell deep inside in himself to get the right language, get the right word in order to define not only the thing, not only the object, not only the material, but also the very experience. And we will see that very soon, and it will be more clear then that what it means. So basically, then poetic thinking is hard to define, but if you try to imagine it, it is thinking itself. Because only in poetry, only in that experience of language as itself, one can speak to innermost core of his existence. And even in a very, very religious sense, God, and here Derrida would say, and not me, God himself is condemned to translate. So God himself is condemned to speak in language. God himself is translating himself into a language of mankind. So in a brilliant essay towards the Babel, he says, God himself is condemned to translate. Let's make it very simple, which is another form of violence, that to simplify is a form of violence, because life and the life world is so complex that simplification can be an act of violence. But here this is to make it less complex. So simple in the sense of making it bit unpacking it, or making it less ambiguous. A poetic thinking, then we can say, that is an experience of language and which touch the inner core of the being, and through which a new language comes in a way we see things. And thinking through poetry is another form of activity in which we immerse ourselves into the language of the poet to think. So you can see there are two ways of itself happening within the poetic space. Heidegger moves further, and here he is doing a poetic activity by picking a poem of a German poet, Thrall. And to begin thinking on the lines of Thrall, Heidegger says, every great poet creates his poetry out of one single poetic statement only. The measure of his greatness is the extent to which he becomes so committed to that singleness that he is able to keep his poetic saying wholly within it. And perhaps it is remarkable, a great poet, and it's true, a lyricist, a singer, other people might be wandering all over the place, but a great poet stays at one place. Every great poet creates his poetry out of one single poetic statement only. And he dwells in it, he lives in it, he experiences it, and he speaks it. And perhaps this work of Rumi is a brilliant example of that, and we will shortly see how it is an example of one poetic statement. And not only him, if you look, most of the poets are basically committed to that single poetic statement. And then Heidegger says that the poet's statement remains unspoken. None of his individual poems, nor their totality, says it all. Nonetheless, every poem speaks from the whole of the one single statement, and in each instance says that statement. From the site of the statement there rises the wave that in each instance moves his saying as poetic saying, but that wave, far from leaving the site behind, in its rise causes all the movement of saying to flow back to its ever more hidden source. The site of the poetic statement, source of the movement giving wave, holds within it the hidden nature of what, from a metaphysical aesthetic point of view, may at first appear to be rhythm. Now this is another interesting point Heidegger is making, because the source of the being is never truly revealed, innermost core of the human being is never truly revealed. Therefore it is important that one poetic statement shall recurrently and repetitively take man there, into that dwelling, into that place in which he can see it unconcealing, see it opening one more time, and then perhaps one more time, and then perhaps infinitely going back to it. And in the case of zikr, as we have seen, as Heidegger would say, that language is not an act of naming things, but an act of summoning things, which is, zikr becomes an act of calling, an act of summoning, an act of constantly inviting something or someone inside their own being. But at the same time, Heidegger is saying what you see as rhythm is not basically a rhythm. It's some kind of metaphysical aesthetic movement through which poet not only experiences language, but moves from that concealment to unconcealment. So that wave is not, that rhythm is not a rhythm to just create an effect into the mind of the listener, but it is perhaps more than that, because that wave takes back a poet or a poetic statement into its innermost core. Now here Heidegger goes further and further, and he argues that all thinking dialogue with the poet's poetic statement stays within this reciprocity between discussion and clarification. And this is another indeed interesting point Heidegger is making. And the dialogue of thinking which poetry aims to call forth the nature of language, so that mortals may learn again to live within language. So the dialogue of thinking, and here it is important that poetic thinking does not mean that poetry is mere thinking, but poetry itself is in conversation with thinking. So this movement or rhythmic movement of language is constantly touching the question of being, which is deep inside a man. So man is someone who is facing the world, who is outside, and his innermost being is deep inside him. And there is a dialogue happening between thinking with poetry. And this dialogue is the only way, in Heideggerian sense, that mortals can experience the language. And then Heidegger picks a statement, poem of Thrall. Picks a statement of Thrall, something strange is the soul on the earth. That's the statement Heidegger picks. And he tries to unlock it, and tries to do a poetic reading of it, and tries to do a thinking through poetry. But I don't want to go into the entire thing. But the statement is, this line which Heidegger picks is, something strange is the soul on the earth. And Heidegger tries to understand that how a poet is experiencing the language, in the sense that experiencing those things within the language, which means how his thinking is reflected through his poetic being. Heidegger questions here is that, but what does a strange mean? By strange, we usually understand something that is not familiar, does not appeal to us, something that is rather a burden and an unease. But the word we are using, the German fremd, the old High German fram, really means forward to somewhere else, under, way toward, onward to the encounter with what is kept in a store for it. The strange goes forth ahead, but it does not roam aimlessly, without any kind of determination. The strange element goes in its search towards the site where it may stay in its wandering, almost unknown to itself. The strange is already following the call that calls it on the way into its own. So this is how, if you want to see how Heidegger is dwelling in, how Heidegger is thinking through poetry. And this thinking is happening in a way that you pick the profound word and you see that how a poet is giving it a meaning. And in that sense, that something strange is the soul on the earth. So something strange is not, the soul is not going into the sky, but it's coming back on earth. Why? And then the poet calls the soul something strange on the earth. The earth is that very place which the soul's wandering could not reach so far. The soul only seeks the earth, it does not flee from it. This fulfills the soul's being in her wandering to seek the earth so that she may poetically build and dwell upon it, and thus may be able to save the earth as earth. The soul then is not by any means first of all soul, and then besides and for whatever reason also a stranger who does not belong on earth. Now, by doing that, Heidegger is basically, what he is doing is trying to see that how a thinking through poetry is possible, how the language is not an objective act of naming something, but also experiencing something, and only through those experiences within the being, by touching the inner core of our existence, a poetic act is possible, which means subject-object divide can be destroyed, which means man can really dwell in the language. Heidegger reflects on few poets like Rilke and Hölderlin and Angela Silesius, and is constantly seeing that how this thinking is happening. And in a poetic activity, thinking is not only, for Heidegger, is speaking, but thinking is hearing as well. So a poetic thinking is not mere a poetic speaking, a poetic statement, but thinking is hearing as well. And by hearing, by living in those rhythms, a thinking is possible. What Heidegger calls it is equi-primordial. And this whole idea of experience, Hölderlin in his poem tries to capture, and he says that much has man experienced, many of the heavenly one has he named, since we have been in a conversation and can listen to one another. And this thinking is basically, a poetic thinking is only possible through that conversation, and not the conversation only which happens between two people, but a conversation which is possible between thinking and poetry in itself. And Heidegger then argues that the being of man is grounded in language, and language is the grounding in which poetry is possible. But here is another problem, that poetry is the ground, or poetic is a ground in which thinking is possible. So if language is the grounding necessary for any poetic activity, poetry is equally important as a ground for any thinking activity. Heidegger says that poetry is the founding naming of the being, end of the essence of all things. So essence of all things, and here important word is essence and things, is the poetic naming of things. No arbitrary saying, but that through which those first comes into the open all that which we then in everyday language talks about and handle. Therefore, poetry never takes up language as and it is another profound statement, that therefore poetry never takes up language as a material that is present at hand, but poetry itself first makes language possible. Poetry is the primal language of an historical people. So what shapes language, what makes language as language possible, is a poetic activity. And only through poetry that is possible. Not only that, Heidegger says that since we know history, we know that this is happening. So all people having history, are people having those poetic experiences, and those experiences of language through poetry. Which in the sense we can conclude by saying that poetry constitutes the ground for any dwelling, without which man is homeless. Now we will try to look into certain moving away from Heidegger, and that's our limited reading of Heidegger, but now we will look into certain poetry itself and try to unpack it And I have picked few poems for you for this session, and we will see how this is possible and how whole thing is an experience through language. I mean, I don't have board, but all these poems are Urdu and Persian poems. So because my poetic thinking is not possible in English, and in English I remain a victim of scientific thinking. Let's pick one from a great Urdu poet, Ghalib. He says that थी वो एक शख्स के तसव्वुर से अब वो रानाई ख्याल कहाँ. It was because of that person's imagination. Right? Let's lose translation. It was because of that person's imagination. Now there is no meaning in this imagination. Leave that second sentence, and I think today it was a good day for board, but unfortunately I don't have. Here you say that he's saying it was because of that one man's imagination. Here two things are important. One man, imagination. Ek shakhs and tasavvur. Any imagination is possible if there is something present in the imagination, right? So that's the point number one. No imagination is imagination of absence. So all imagination is basically imagination of the presence. Point number two here is that what occupies that imagination is that man, that person, not he or she, not a beloved, not a friend, not an enemy, not my father, but that person. Who is that person? Now this person is without personality, and therefore he can populate the regime of imagination. If he was an exact person, if he was a given person, if he was this or that person, then he would not come to populate my imagination. In that sense, my imagination would never stretch. My imagination has stretched because my imagination was illuminated. My imagination was lived experience of imagination. It was only possible because there was a strangeness of that person which was coming to my imagination. So which means imagination is only stretched by strangeness. And if you don't have something strange, if you are not estranged by something, it means your imagination cannot go further. And what collapses the imagination is the absence of the strangeness. Let's see another anarchist poet, and this is more profound, perhaps more interesting, and we will build on all of it. There is an anarchist poet. If you look at Ghalib, the profound poetic statement throughout in his poetic work is the imagination of that person. Even God is that imagination of that person. And he constantly talks about it. Since most of you don't know Urdu, I don't want to bore you with Urdu, and then I don't want to bore myself with translation. I'm saving it for more important couplets. This is another interesting text. The poet says that तारीख़ रोज़गार फ़ना लिख रहा हूँ मैं, दीबाचे वजूद पे ला लिख रहा हूँ मैं. He's an anarchist poet who doesn't believe in God. But what is he saying? His theme, persistent theme, is la. Now la is an Arabic word, we all know it. La means, in a very, very mundane sense, what it means? No, right? No. Let's try to translate the second line, and let's focus on the second line. He is saying that basically I am writing a history of fana. I don't know how you translate what speaks to you in translation. Fana, it's a total annihilation, right? Total destruction of being, not self, being. And here's a difference, we all know that. दीबाचे वजूद पे ला लिख रहा हूँ मैं. On the preface of being, I am writing nothingness. On the preface of wujud, I am writing la. what it means. What is poet trying to indicate? What is he trying to communicate? More than that, what is he trying to experience, or what he has already experienced? Why and how one can write on the preface of being nothingness? How can you write nothingness on the preface of the being? How there can be a preface of the preface? How can there be a beginning of the beginning? And at the beginning of the beginning, how can you write no? Now here it's the most profound thing, if you are thinking poetically, that la, which is no, and in Islamic tradition, everything begins with la. La ilaha illallah. What is la? What is this negation? This negation is the most profound affirmation. This is the most affirmative negation. Only by this negation, everything positive is possible. Only by this clearing, anything else is possible. And until this negation happens, wujud is not experienced. A wujud can only be possibly experienced by this negation. Then the whole meaning of la changes. Then truth is not haqq, truth is la. Truth is not based on haqq, truth is based on this negation. Which means the true definition of truth begins with negation. Which means what Greeks have already said, that truth is, the word for truth was aletheia, right? Aletheia. Aletheia, Heidegger says, is a negative connotation already, because letheia is concealment. Aletheia is unconcealment. If truth is unhiddenness of things, if truth is unconcealment of the thing, then truth is only possible by a negative statement. That's the most affirmative negative statement. By only clearing the ground, the being is possible. It means by negating everything else, a truth is possible. In a way, truth is relying on a negative statement. It means truth is a negative statement. It will start with denouncing. It will start with denying. It cannot start with accepting things. It cannot start there. If it has to start, if there is a dibacha, if there is a preface of wujud, of being, then it can only be written by la. It can only be written by a negation. It cannot be written by the preface of the being, cannot be written by being. A wujud cannot write itself. A wujud is not possible, impossibly or possibly capable of experience the wujud itself. It is only possible through that law. Only through that clearing of the ground, that the ground for unconcealment is possible. Let's take another example from Ghalib. He says that जानता हूँ सवाबे तातो ज़ुहद पर तबीयत इधर नहीं आती. I know the virtues of obedience, but still I cannot orient myself there. Here what is important is a very simple, and all Muslims in India who don't go to mosque use this couplet. But it is an interesting couplet because there is a tension, and it's a very Heideggerian tension, that he knows. So epistemological ground is well founded. He knows that there is a virtue in obedience and piousness. But tabiyat, which is my inner being, is not oriented towards it. The tension between knowing and orientation, and this is what Heidegger is constantly trying to point out, that he knows it's no problem. So the beginning of the statement itself is I know that there is a virtue in obedience, there is a virtue in being good, but I cannot orient myself there. So the knowing, which is the epistemological ground, cannot orient man alone, which means the grounding for orientation is only possible by negating knowledge. And we will see in Maulana very, very soon that. Let's see another much more difficult text. And I wish again, and I can only wish that there was a board here. Kabhi ae, and it's my fault, I should have told Umar. Kabhi ae haqiqat muntazar, nazara libas majaz mein, कि हजार सजदे तड़प रहे हैं तेरी जबीन नयाज में. It's another beautiful lyrical poem, and you can see the rhythm even if you don't know the language. That कभी ऐ हकीकत मुंतजर नजर आ लिबास मजाज में कि हजार सजदे तड़प रहे हैं तेरी जबीन नयाज में. I'm leaving the second line again. I'm just trying to focus on the first line. There are three keywords here. कभी ऐ हकीकत मुंतजर नजर आ लिबास मजाज में. There are three keywords. हकीकत मुंतजर, नजर, लिबास मजाज. There are three words. हकीकत मुंतजर, the truth which is in waiting. So a truth which is waiting. What is this to begin with? Right? Truth which is waiting. A truth which is waiting for itself. But it means that there is no truth. Right? We will see that very soon. Nazar, to see, to witness, to envision. And libas-e majaz. This is another interesting metaphor. What is libas-e majaz? So libas-e majaz is can be translated as metaphor, can be translated as material form, can be translated as some sort of proxy truth, right? Now, kabhi ay haqiqat muntazir, oh awaiting truth, right? Oh awaiting truth, let me see you in your material form. Let's loose translate it. Oh awaiting truth, let me see you in material form, which means not in its true form, right? And material is a very bad translation of a majaz. It's you say metaphorical form. Let's translate again. Oh awaiting truth, let me see you in your metaphorical form. What it means. Here it is very interesting that the poet or poetic being is addressing not to that libas, not to that cloth, not to that form of metaphor, but to truth itself. Oh truth, but which truth? And it's not haqq, it's haqiqah. There's another problem happening here, because haqiqat is partial, it's incomplete. And here is another tension between truth and reality. Truth is not concerned with partiality, while haqiqat is concerned with partiality. Reality is temporal. Reality is founded in its context. Haqiqat is founded on its temporality. Haqq is not. But haqq is not addressed here. A part of haqq, which is haqiqah, which is haqiqat, which is reality, which is waiting. Why it is waiting is another question. Why haqiqat is muntazar? Why it is in waiting? Why, for whom it is waiting? Is it waiting for the being to call so that it can unleash, it can unveil, it can unconceal, or there is something else? Now, another problem here is that haqiqat muntazar cannot be seen in its true form. So truth cannot be seen in truth form. It means haqq is not possible to be seen, and he is not asking for experience, he wants to see it. But he cannot see it in its true form. So he's saying, at least come in a metaphorical form. At least let me experience it, not experience by only by experiencing through seeing. And John Berger talks a lot about it in ways of seeing. He also talks very interesting tension about language and seeing, and he talks about how language determines seeing, but he does not go into detail. And anyway, it's a small book. So you see the tension that there is a truth which is not full truth. So only a full truth is waiting for itself to unconceal, but it cannot unconceal only in metaphorical form. So only in experience of language one can see the truth. Again, Heideggerian point. Let's go to much more difficult, and perhaps on these a few others we will. It's already 8:05. Let's go to our promised person, which is Maulana Rumi. Now, Maulana is perhaps the most difficult, but at the same time easiest poet, because his poetry is emanating from one poetic statement, and that we all know is love. And at the same time, he deepens love to that level that perhaps it's not easy to even go one level of it or two levels of it. I have picked few difficult bit of it. This is another in Masnavi, and we will go to Masnavi as well. I mean, in its real form. But this is another interesting text. Maulana says, Noor dida su dida baz gasht, mandar saudae u sehra dasht. Noor dida su dida baz gasht, mandar saudae u sehra dasht. Chunke zin virana nourash baz gasht, mandar sehra dida baz gasht. Let me again try to translate in a very loose form. And it's another very difficult thing which Maulana is doing here. And this poem in Masnavi is concerned with the soul of awliya and arifin. And he is basically talking about those pious men's soul, how it lives on earth and how it leaves the earth. That's Maulana's concern in this poem. He ends the poem on these two couplets. Noor dida su dida baz gasht, man dar saudaeu sehrao dasht. And we will take all these four lines. The light of the eye, and the light is not this light. Maulana's light, there was no electric bulb anyway at that time, so it's a noor. But noor has a lot of meaning, we know already. Noor dida su dida baz gasht. Light of the eye, return to the eye. Mandar saudae sehrao dasht. Forest and desert was left wandering and mourning in that departure. Let's try to understand it again. And perhaps here you will see another, in a way, Heideggerian aspect, that subject-object distinction is totally destroyed. How we think that subject is constituted by certain consciousness. Here the consciousness, the basis of the consciousness itself is displaced. Noor dida su dida baz gasht. The light of the eye returned to the eye. So the light departed. From where? Because the light of the eye was focused on forest and desert. And what happened? It departed from there. And what happened? The forest and desert were left mourning, were left in certain state of sadness, in certain state of wilderness. Where is it returning? What it means that Noor is leaving the eye and coming back to eye. So the life of these material, which is forest and desert in this case, is basically based on the light of the awliya. So light of a good soul, which means the gaze of a good soul was giving it a life. It means everything had a life and everything have a life. And Maulana talks about it, even about the tree, Hannana. And we all know this very famous story that there was a tree, Hannana, on which Prophet Muhammad used to put his back and give khutbah. And then they eventually made a member, and then he started to give khutbah from those pulpit. And one day he saw in his dream that Hannana is crying and saying, why you left me? Why your back departed? Why there is a firaq? And in firaq, in that longing, that tree is crying. And Maulana says, Falsafi go munkire Hannana ast, as bekhabar ze maqame payghambaran ast. A philosopher might not agree to this kind of a story because he does not know the status of prophecy and vilayat. So Maulana argues that everything has a life. But here in this case, the life into this wild places, which is desert and forest, is only coming through the certain gaze. Certain gaze is making the life possible. Certain gaze is constituting not object but subject. So the consciousness of subject is dependent on the gaze. And this is what Heideggerian point is as well. That there is no stable objective thing. There is no objective truth. when a subject penetrates that object, object becomes subject. In a way, a gaze dislocated, even in imagination, in seeing. And then Maulana said, Chunke zi veeran nurash bazgasht, maan dar sehrae dida bazgasht. And since that light has left the wilderness, what is left in the forest of the eye is mere longing and waiting. Now, this is very complicated, what Maulana is doing. Perhaps simple and complicated. That since this happened, since the light, the nur left to the place where it originally belonged, what left in the eye? Whose eye? And who was earlier eye to which it, now there are two eyes in the two couplets. To one eye it returned, and leaving all these places sad. While in another case, it returned to its source, leaving the eye itself, what was left in the forest of eye is longing. Because the nur left. Because that light left. What is forest? And what happens when the light leaves there? And why eye is a forest? And what wali? And here Maulana's wali is not a wali who lives somewhere in the corner and doing 5 times a prayer. Maulana's wali is an ashiq. Maulana's wali's wilayat is based on love. So a lover is one who does not, in traditional sense, does not seek a job in Sainsbury or Microsoft, right? He does not seek a job. Lovers don't seek job. And we will see in the beginning itself in Masnavi, a lover lives in wilderness. Lover lives in madness. Lover lives in passion. And in that passion, in wilderness, in madness, he gives life to the things which apparently looks lifeless. There is a brilliant poem in Urdu which says that ग़ज़ालां तुम तो वाक़िफ़ हो, कहो मजनू के मरने की, दीवाना मर गया आखिर को वीराने पे क्या गुजरी. O gazelle, you are well aware of that Majnoon, of that madman. Tell me how wilderness feels itself when the madman has left. Now, gazelle is an important metaphor, even in Maulana and even in Urdu Persian tradition. A very important allegory. What is gazelle? So, one meaning of gazelle is a custodian of wilderness. Only a gazelle's eye can hold the madness, the passion of a madman. Because it is gazelle which witnesses the madman's life, Majnoon's life, or lover's life. So a life of an eye, so which means life of seeing, which means seeing itself is valueless if there is no light in it, which means seeing, which means object of seeing, which means eye is like a forest. Forest which does not distinguish between night and day in a dense forest, which does not distinguish between good and bad, which does not distinguish between good animal and bad animal, and everything is trying to eat the other. That's what happens in the forest. While nur, if the light returns to the eye, it will emancipate you from that kind of madness, that kind of violence, that kind of eating each other. And Maulana talks about it, that the world is world of akil and makul. Everything is eating the other. I don't want to go there, but it's a fantastic piece of argument which Maulana is making. Let's take one more piece, and then we will move to one more here, and then perhaps, I don't know, I don't want to. Maulana also says that this is in Diwan-e-Shams, it's not Masnavi. I don't want to take the entire poem, it's really, really, really beautiful, and Ali Qurbani has sung it extremely beautifully. But there is one line here. Shabru ha wasil shuad, maqsood ha hasil shuad. Shabru ha wasil shuad, maqsood ha hasil shuad. Every night the ruh departs for union. And what is maqsood in that union is hasil, to extract something from the beloved. And then Maulana talks, if one is aware that what is leaving him every night is his soul. And if you don't allow the soul to become one in night with the beloved, with the ultimate being, then you will not get anything. It means you will never get to experience. Which means the longing will not be felt. Someone who does not long is not a lover. Right? Even a Facebook lover, Twitter lover, a modern day lover also waits for message. Also waits for whether the person has seen the message. Is it a blue tick on WhatsApp or not? Right? Even a modern day lover waits for. A lover is one who is a prisoner of waiting. He constantly waits. And one who cannot wait, one who does not know how to wait, or one who has no feeling of waiting is not lover at all. He is not a lover. He cannot love. Because love is that pain of longing. And there is a brilliant couplet which I always always recite of Saadi, which I am missing. It's a I'm sorry, I missed it, or my brain missed it, or it is archived somewhere in the brain and I cannot fetch it. But what Saadi is saying that दिले के आशिक साबिर बुअद मगर संगस्त ज़ इश्क़ ताब सबूरी हज़ार फरसंगस्त. A heart which is patient and which is a lover is not a heart but a stone, because there is 1,000 miles of distance between love and patience. So love is always in tension with patience. A lover is always impatient. Love demands impatience. Love demands longing. So if you know that every night your shabruha wasil shuat, maqsoodha hasil shuat, if every night your soul is departing for the union, and that union is maqsood, is objected towards to gain something from that union, so that longing should deepen. Right? A good lover is one in a very very simple sense as well. When he meets, he longs. Right? And there are plenty of Urdu poetry and Persian poetry, and I'm sure in each culture of the world there will be poems in which you will find that a lover's heart beats faster even if he has met the beloved. And once he leaves, he starts longing. So he meets not only, he never meets for ultimate union. And therefore a good love is a love which is incomplete, which is impossible, which will never happen, and which will only happen when we become impossible. Because there is another tension which I don't want it to touch, but there is a tension between to seek and to get. So once you seek, you have the pleasure of getting it. But once you get it, you don't have the pleasure of seeking it. From very objective point of view, from a mobile phone, you buy iPhone 7, stand in the line, you get it, and then it's ringing all the time and you trash it. You keep it silent. You don't want to see your mobile. In the same way, perhaps not in the same way, in a much more complex way, what we seek is, once we get it, we no longer seek, which means we perish, which means foundation is, therefore we are seeking something which is impossible, which is God himself, which is the ultimate beloved, which is the creator. And even the beloved, which is comes in a physical form, which we call in Urdu tradition or Persian tradition as ishq majazi, a metaphorical love. So a girl or a boy is not a haqiqi lover. It's not a true lover. A true lover is the creator of that lover. So this is a metaphorical lover. And perhaps if you connect this to Iqbal's earlier poem, it means a truth is waiting in the beloved so that he can see the beloved, and if he sees the beloved, the truth in a way unleashes or unveils. So I don't want to go further, but let's see few from Masnavi, and you can stop me if I am already sort of Okay, I will skip. I will not do a lot of commentary on that. Let's see what Maulana is. And you can Maulana is talking something very phenomenal here, actually. And unfortunately, I don't have time, but it's a question of time which Maulana has addressed brilliantly. Maulana says, Pas tera har lahza margo rajat ast, Mustafa farmud dunya saat ast. Har nafas nu me shavad dunya oma, bekhabar az no shadan andar baqa. Umar hamchu juwe no nomi rasad, mustamare me namayat dar jasad. Shakh atish rab jambani basaz, dar nazar atish numayat bas daraz. Maulana is talking about life and death, and what lives as time of life and what lives as time of death. Maulana says that each moment, there is a death happening, and each moment a return is happening. Because Muhammad has said that this world is a world of moment. And in each breath, a new world is formed. But we are unaware of that formation because we are not paying attention, because we are not conscious. And this world is like, life is like the water flowing on the river, which means Maulana is saying that if you see a river, you see it flowing, you always see the surface, you never see anything disappearing, while it's not the same water at that point, at any point, right? So the water is changing constantly, but at the same time when someone looks, he sees there is a surface, but actually there is no surface. Everything is constantly changing and moving towards something, and moving towards something to return back in a way. So Maulana is saying that if you see that life is like this, looks life, it looks floating, it looks appearing, it looks present, but it's not present. It's already dying constantly. When I see you, it's not what I saw you 30 seconds ago. So in a way, we are floating on the world clock, but actually we are getting replaced very constantly. Anyway, I mean, there is a lot to talk about it. I mean, on few metaphors, allegories as well, but I am leaving. Do you allow me to just pick from the beginning of the Masnavi and then, or in fact, in a democratic way, if everyone allows me to? Maulana says in the beginning itself, and Maulana, if someone knows Maulana, and I hope everyone knows Maulana very well, use the metaphor and allegory of and symbol of flute. And that's a very consistent theme in Maulana. And Maulana says a lot of things through flute. You will see in this. I am not reading everything. I am just picking few couplets to just point out how Maulana is destroying the way scientific thinking happens, bringing everything into the life world, destroying the subject-object consciousness, and seeing that our consciousness is embedded in the consciousness of other things as well, in the forest, in the desert, in the wilderness, in the madness, the things which are not material, even those immaterial things holds our consciousness if we know it, if we feel it, if we experience it through language. And if we don't experience it through language, then we are nowhere. We are like an ignorant bunch of crap. Maulana says that हर कसे को दूर मांद असल खुश बाज जुइद रोजगारे वसल खुश. If someone if someone escapes the foundation of his being, all his life he keeps seeking and finds nothing. Because again, isn't it very Heideggerian, or isn't Heidegger very Rumian? Because Heidegger was born 800 years after Maulana, and obviously he was informed by Sufi tradition. If you are not seeking something in the innermost being, you're obviously seeking something outside, and you will keep seeking, getting nothing. And then Maulana, I mean, it goes on, and I don't want to. Maulana says about flute that Sirre man naznale man dur nis, leek chashmo gosh ra anur nis, tanz jao janzatan mastur nis, leek kasra deej jan dastur nis. Beautiful. Anyway, Atishast e bang naev nist bad, हर के ई आतिश नदारा नीस्त बात आतिश इश्कस्त कांदर ने फताद जोशिश इश्कस्त कांदर में फताद. Maulana says that, you know this, that Maulana is talking about flute. I think it's here as well. When we play a flute, I am not a good player. I have played it in moment of playfulness. So I don't know how to play it. But Maulana is saying that what is coming out of these flute is not air. As we blow it, air comes out. He says, no, it's not the air which is coming out of this flute. What is coming out of this flute is fire. And what is bansuri? What is nae? What is flute? What is flute? Flute is man. Flute is the being. Then Maulana is saying that if what is coming out of this flute is not air but the fire, and one who does not have the fire is already perished. He no longer exists. One who does not have that fire has already perished. And then he brings something very beautiful. I mean, I don't have time to go in all of it, but anyway. Atishe ishqast ka andar ne fatad, joshishe ishqast ka andar mai fatad. It is the fire of love which is burning in the flute. It is the passion of love which is sort of boiling in the wine. And this is phenomenal. It is love which is becoming a soul of the flute. And wine is not wine, is a wine of delirium and madness for Maulana. For Maulana, wine is a thing for passion. And thing of passion is passionate only by love. If only the fire of love kisses those wine, then there is a wine, otherwise it's delirium. And then the Maulana defines flute. I just want to touch it and move forward. Anyway. दूध दहाँ दारेम गोया हम चुने यक दहाँ पिन्हास दर लभाए वे यक दहाँ नाला शुदा सुए शुमा हाय हु दर फगंदा दर समा. Like the flute, we all have two mouths. One is on the lips and one is hiding at the other end, which is obviously connected to infinite, which is connected to impossible, to divine in Maulana. One mouth is towards you, crying and longing and sad, and another is towards the sky, making a lot of noise. So it means how you behave on this end, it will resonate on the other end. So the divine is deeply connected with the being, and how being is oriented, the divine is also oriented. And we have seen many ahadith on that, many sayings of the Prophet, that how eye becomes the eye of the God and how everything, we all know it. So in the end, Ghalib's orientation problem is raised by Maulana. Again Maulana is saying, Baad azma mast shudne ma azu, Ghalib azma hast shudne ma azu. Maulana says that wine is mad, or mine is in delirium because of my being. I am not in delirium because of wine. Again, he is destabilizing the subject-object distinction. Wine is not making me mad. It's my passion and burning and longing which is creating that essence in the wine. Otherwise, wine has no meaning. And in the same way, the body has not given me life. The life has given body something. Again, upsetting the Cartesian principle of cogito ergo sum. Let's move to last 3 lines and I will finish. Shad basha ishq khush saudae ma, ay tabibe jumla illat haye ma, ay dawaye nikhwato namus ma, ay tu aflatun o jali nus ma, jism khakaz ishq bar aflak shud, ko hudar raqs amado chalak shud. This is fantastic. Shad basha ishq khush saudae ma, ay tabibe jumla illat haye ma, jism khakaz ishq bar aflak shud, ko hudar raqs amado chalak shud. He's addressing the mad lover. He's saying, "Oh, my mad lover, please stay blessed and happy, because you are the real doctor of all our illness." So the real doctor is not the doctor who is constantly telling you what to eat and what not to eat, where to go and what to feel, what means depression and what does not mean depression. In a today's psychiatrist eye, every lover is a madman. And Maulana is saying that one who is completely burning inside, one who is completely destroying himself, is one who should be blessed, is the one who has the right medicine for all of us. And let's skip the other line because I need to then go into it. I don't want to go there. So last line, and this is fantastic. Jism khakas ishq bar aflaq shud, koh dar raqs amado chalak shud. This body, which is made of mud and soil, and which is perishable, and which is very material, and which is very temporal, only because of love it reached eternity, it reached infinity, it reached the sky, but the sky is infinity, it reached the realm of impossible, it reached to the divine, only because of love. And only because of love and the lover, these mountains are dancing and have become aware of themselves and then dancing again. And it is basically pointing to Moses, Musa, and the mountain is Tur, and the Tur just felt the God's light, and it shattered, it started to dance. So because of love, everything comes to life. Even if a lover touches the mountain, even if he sees the mountain, even if he gazes, and we have already seen, Nur Dida Suye Dida Basgash, even if a lover's eye penetrates the mountain feels it. On this note, I will finish today's talk, and now we can have question and answer or comment or anything which left unexplained for you. Thank you very much.